In this video, you will learn a very solid development plan for playing against the Sicilian defense. After the move e4, black can play c5, the Sicilian defense. White can play knight f3, developing his king's knight and taking control of the d4 square, with the idea of following up with d4 and occupying the center with his pawns. And, if black captures on d4, white can recapture with the knight. Now, one of the most commonly used moves is d6, taking control of the e5 square, with the idea of following up with knight f6 to attack the e4 pawn without allowing the white pawn to advance further. Now, white can play bishop e5 check, initiating a very solid plan to play against the Sicilian defense, which gives white good control of the game without allowing the opponent to get counterplay. Now, black has three options. He can defend against check with knight d7. But then white can play d4, occupying the center with his pawns. After c takes d4. White can capture on d4 with his queen. The white queen cannot be attacked with the knight from c6, and white has very good play. He can castle short and continue with moves like c4, knight c3, to increase control over the central squares. He can complete his development with bishop e3 or bishop g5, and maintain good control of the game. After the move bishop b5 check, black can defend against check with the move knight c6. However, white can castle and then continue with moves like bishop takes c6 to weaken the opponent's pawn structure. They can also continue with moves like c4, d4, knight c3 to increase their control over the center squares. They can also play h3 to take control of the g4 square and prevent the opposing pieces from using it. White has very good play. After the move bishop b5 check, black can respond with bishop d7, defending with the bishop. White can play bishop takes d7 check. After the queen takes d7, white can play c4, increasing their control over the d5 square. If black now plays queen g4, attacking the g2 pawn and the e4 pawn. White can castle to secure his king and defend the g2 pawn. After queen takes e4, black has won a pawn and is threatening to capture the c4 pawn. But he has fallen behind in development. White can play d4, placing a pawn in the center and blocking the action of the black queen. After c takes d4, white plays knight takes d4. White can continue with knight c3, developing the queen's knight and attacking the black queen. After, for example, knight f6. White can play knight c3, developing his queen's knight and attacking the opponent's queen. Black can play queen g4, trying to exchange queens. White can play queen a4 check. After knight b to d7. White can play knight c to b5, threatening to give check on c7, which would win. After, for example, the rook on c8, white plays h3, attacking the opponent's queen and forcing it to retreat. After the queen, e4. White plays the queen takes a7 and has a clear advantage. After the c4 move, we will follow a masterful game in which we can see how white has a very easy game. Now black played the knight on f6, developing his king's knight and threatening to capture the e4 pawn. White played the knight on c3, developing his queen's knight and defending the e4 pawn. Black played g6, aiming to develop the king's bishop on the g7 square. White played d4, occupying the center with his pawns. The game continued with c takes d4, eliminating the opponent's central pawn. White played knight takes d4. Black played the bishop on g7, developing his king's bishop and preparing to castle. White played h3, taking control of the g4 square to prevent the enemy pieces from using it. White's plan was to continue with the e3 bishop, preventing black's knight g4 response. Black castled. White played bishop e3, completing the development of his minor pieces. Black played the c8 rook, threatening to capture the c4 pawn. White played b3, defending the c4 pawn. White has a very solid position and has good control of the position. Black played the c6 knight, completing the development of his minor pieces. White played the c1 rook, removing his rook from the opposing bishop's attack line where it could be in danger. At the same time, White activated his rook, brought it closer to the central files, and defended his c3 knight. Black played knight takes d4, eliminating White's knight from the center with the idea of exchanging pieces to simplify the position and facilitate defense. The game continued with bishop takes d4. Black played queen e6, threatening to capture the e4 pawn. White castled. Now it wouldn't be good to have knight take e4. Because White responds with bishop takes g7. And after king takes g7. White plays knight d5, centralizing his knight. White can continue with moves like queen d4, rook e1, and have an advantage. In the game, after White castled, Black played knight d7, freeing up the action for the bishop on g7, with the idea of continuing to exchange pieces to facilitate the defense. White played f4, beginning to advance with his pawns on the kingside and taking control of the e5 square. Black played bishop takes d4 check. White played queen d4. Black played knight f6, returning his knight to the kingside to defend in this area. White played rook c to e1, repositioning his rook with the idea of advancing with e5 and initiating the attack. Black played queen d7, removing his queen from the opponent's rook's attack line. White played f5, gaining space on the kingside and preparing to attack against the enemy's castling. Now it's not possible to play g takes f5, capturing the white pawn, since White plays rook takes f5. They can continue with moves like rook e to f1, with the idea of preparing the attack on the kingside, and White have an advantage. In the game, after the f5 move, Black played rook c5, activating his rook on the 5th rank, to try to stop the opponent's attack. White played knight d5, centralizing his knight. Now White threatens to capture on f6, which would win. Black played knight takes d5, eliminating the white knight from the center. The game continued e takes d5, and now the e file is open, and White can push along this file. Now it would not be possible to play g takes f5, because White plays queen d3 and is threatening to capture the f5 pawn and is winning. For example, in the case of e6 to defend the pawn. White can play queen d2, threatening to invade via the g5 square to check the enemy king. After, for example, e takes d5. White plays queen g5 check and has a decisive attack. For example, after king h8. White plays queen f6 check. After king g8, White plays rook f3, threatening to check with the rook on g3, and the black king will not escape mate. For example, after f4, to take control of the g3 square and avoid the opponent's threat. White plays queen takes f4, with the idea of following up with rook g3 check, and White has a winning attack. In the game, after the move e takes d5, Black played rook e8, bringing his queen's rook into play and strengthening the defense of the e7 pawn. White played queen g4, moving his queen to the kingside and aiming for the opposing king. White threatened to capture on g6, which would discover an attack on the opponent's queen. The game continued rook c7, returning with his rook and defending his queen. White played f takes g6. Now, it would not be possible to move queen takes g4 because White plays g takes f7 check and wins. In the game, after the move f takes g6, Black played h takes g6. And now, how would you continue as White? Now White played rook e6, a very good move. The rook invades the enemy camp and prevents the e7 pawn from advancing. White threatens rook, takes g6, and has a decisive attack. For example, in the case of f takes e6. White plays queen takes g6 check, and the black king is mated. Since after king h8, White plays rook f7, threatening to checkmate with queen g7 or queen h7, and Black cannot prevent it. In the game, after the move rook e6, black played king g7. What would you play as white? White played rook f7, check, sacrificing the rook to completely destroy the opponent's king's defenses. The game continued. King takes f7. Queen takes g6, check. King f8. Queen f5, check, and black resigned. Since after king g7, white plays rook g6, check. And after king h7, white plays queen h5, checkmate. A very instructive game in which we saw a very solid system to play against the Sicilian defense, allowing white to maintain good control of the position and have very good chances of fighting for the advantage.